Picture this. It's October 17th, 1777, and you're a British officer standing in the morning fog near Saratoga, New York. Your red coat is soaked through from sleeping in the mud. You haven't had a proper meal in 4 days. Your men are hollow-eyed and shaking, not from cold, but from fear. Through the mist, you can hear them. Thousands of American voices, war cries echoing through the forest like wolves surrounding wounded prey. Your commander, General John Burgoyne, promised you this would be a simple march from Canada to New York City. He said the rebels were cowards who would scatter at the sight of British steel. He was wrong, dead wrong. In 6 hours, you will surrender your sword to a ragtag army of farmers and shopkeepers. The British Empire, the greatest military power on earth, is about to suffer a defeat so catastrophic that it will change the course of human history. This isn't just a battle. It's the moment the world realizes that empires can bleed. Before diving into the story of how everything went so terribly wrong for the British, if you enjoy learning about the turning points that shaped our world, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these pivotal moments together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared fascination with history. To understand why British soldiers are starving in an American forest, you have to go back to 1776. The American Revolution is in its second year, and from London's perspective, it's going rather well. Yes, the colonists have declared independence. Yes, they've won a few skirmishes. But the British establishment isn't worried. They see this rebellion as a tantrum thrown by ungrateful children who need to be disciplined. The Royal Navy controls the seas. British regulars are the finest infantry in the world. The Empire has crushed rebellions before in Scotland, in Ireland, in India. America will be no different. Or so they think. The British strategy for 1777 is elegant in its simplicity. It's called the Northern Campaign, and on paper, it's brilliant. 3 armies will converge on the Hudson River Valley, cutting the rebellious colonies in half. General William Howe will march north from New York City with 10,000 men. Lieutenant Colonel Barry St. Ledger will push east from Lake Ontario with 2,000 troops. And the main thrust, the hammer that will crush the rebellion, will come from Canada. Leading this force is Lieutenant General John Burgoyne, a man whose confidence far exceeds his competence. Burgoyne is 55 years old, a playwright, a gambler, and a politician who happens to wear a general's uniform. In London's fashionable clubs, they call him Gentleman Johnny. He's charming, witty, and utterly convinced of his own genius. He's spent the winter in London, wining and dining ministers, selling them on his grand plan. He's promised King George III that he will march 7,300 men from Canada, down Lake Champlain, capture Fort Ticonderoga, sweep through the Hudson Valley, and link up with Howe in New York City. The rebellion will be cut in 2. New England will be isolated. The war will be over by Christmas. The king loves it. Parliament applauds. Burgoyne gets his command and sails back to Canada, already imagining his triumphant return to London. But there's a problem that Gentleman Johnny hasn't considered. He's planned this campaign looking at maps in comfortable London townhouses, maps that show rivers, forts, and towns, maps that don't show the reality of the American wilderness, maps that don't account for the fact that between Canada and New York City lies 200 miles of the most hostile terrain in North America, dense forests where armies can vanish, swamps that swallow wagons, rivers that shift course with every storm, and perhaps most dangerously, a population that hates you with every fiber of their being. Burgoyne's army that assembles at St. John's on the Richelieu River in June of 1777 is an impressive sight. 7,300 men in perfect formation, 4,000 British regulars in their red coats and white crossbelts, 3,000 German mercenaries, mostly from Brunswick, in their blue uniforms, 400 Canadians, 400 Native American warriors. Add to that a massive baggage train, 138 artillery pieces, everything from light 3-pounders to massive 24-pound siege guns, over 1,000 horses, hundreds of wagons, and Burgoyne's personal luggage, which includes his mistress, his extensive wine collection, and his library. This isn't an army built for speed. It's a parade that happens to have muskets. The campaign starts brilliantly. On June 20th, the army moves south down Lake Champlain in a flotilla of boats. It's a magnificent spectacle. Flags snapping in the wind, bands playing, officers in their finest uniforms. The British are coming, and they want everyone to know it. On July 1st, they arrive at Fort Ticonderoga, the Gibraltar of America, the fortress that commands the route to New York. The Americans have 3,000 men garrisoning it, but they're poorly trained militia. Burgoyne studies the fort and smiles. There's a hill overlooking the fort called Mount Defiant. The Americans have left it undefended because they think it's too steep to get artillery up. Burgoyne's engineers think otherwise. On July 5th, the Americans wake up to see British guns pointing down at them from the supposedly impossible height. Their commander, Arthur St. Clair, realizes instantly that his position is hopeless. That night, under cover of darkness, the entire American garrison abandons the fort and flees south. The British wake up on July 6th to find Ticonderoga deserted. It's a bloodless triumph. Burgoyne sends a jubilant dispatch to London. Fort Ticonderoga has fallen. In Parliament, they're ecstatic. King George reportedly ran into the Queen's bedroom shouting, "I have beat them. I have beat all the Americans." Burgoyne is a genius. The rebellion is collapsing. Victory is certain. This moment of euphoria blinds everyone in London to a simple truth. Taking an empty fort is not the same as defeating an army. The Americans haven't been beaten. They've retreated to fight another day, and every mile Burgoyne marches south stretches his supply lines thinner. From Ticonderoga, Burgoyne faces a choice. The easy route south is to go back to Lake Champlain, sail to the southern end, and then march overland. It's the long way, but it's the safe way. But Burgoyne is intoxicated by his success. He decides to take the direct route, marching his massive army overland through 23 miles of wilderness to the Hudson River. On a map, it looks simple. In reality, it's suicide. The Americans know he's coming. As his army advances, American axemen race ahead, felling trees across every road. They dam streams to create swamps. They burn bridges. They destroy every mill and barn. Burgoyne's 7,300 men, his artillery, his wagons, all of it has to be dragged through a deliberately created nightmare. The march that should take a week takes 23 miles in 24 days. The army is crawling at less than 1 mile per day. Soldiers are hacking through fallen trees in 90-degree heat. Horses are dying in the mud. Wagons are breaking axles. And all the while, American snipers are picking off stragglers from the forest shadows. The British can't see them, can't catch them. They just hear the crack of a rifle, and another man falls. It's psychological warfare at its finest. The mighty British Army, which paraded so confidently down Lake Champlain, is being bled to death by an invisible enemy. Morale is crumbling. The German mercenaries, who were told this would be easy money, are starting to desert. By the end of July, Burgoyne finally reaches the Hudson River at Fort Edward. His army is exhausted, depleted, and running low on supplies. He's lost 200 men, not to battle, but to disease, desertion, and sniper fire. But he's made it. He's on the Hudson. He sends word to General Howe in New York City. "I'm here, march north. Let's link up and crush these rebels." And then he waits for a reply, and waits, and waits. The reply, when it finally comes, is devastating. Howe isn't coming north. He's decided, without telling Burgoyne, to sail his army to Philadelphia instead. He's going to capture the rebel capital, because in his mind, that's more glorious than helping another general. Burgoyne has just been abandoned. His entire strategy, the three-pronged convergence that was supposed to cut America in half, has fallen apart. Howe has gone rogue. St. Leger's column is pinned down at Fort Stanwix. And Burgoyne is alone, deep in enemy territory, with an army that's running out of food. A smart commander would retreat, go back to Ticonderoga, consolidate, regroup, but Burgoyne can't retreat. His ego won't allow it. He's promised the king victory. He's told Parliament he's a genius. If he turns back now, he'll be humiliated. So he doubles down. He decides to push south to Albany, with or without help. It's a decision born of pride, and it will cost him everything. But first, he needs supplies. His army is starving. His horses are dying. He needs food, and he needs it now. His scouts report that there's a supply depot in the village of Bennington, 40 miles to the east. It's supposedly lightly guarded by militia. Burgoyne orders Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich Baum to take 800 men, mostly German mercenaries, and seize the supplies. It should be a simple raid. It's not. On August 16th, Baum's column walks into a trap. The Americans have 2,000 men waiting for them, led by General John Stark, a New Hampshire farmer who fought at Bunker Hill. Stark doesn't do complicated tactics. He just surrounds the Germans and attacks from all sides. The Battle of Bennington lasts 2 hours. It's a slaughter. Baum is killed. His force is annihilated. 200 dead, 700 captured. A relief column sent to help them is also destroyed. Burgoyne has lost over 1,000 men, and he hasn't captured a single sack of flour. The news spreads across New England like wildfire. The invincible British army has been humiliated by farmers. Militia are pouring in from Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut. Every man with a musket wants a piece of Burgoyne. By early September, Burgoyne's situation is desperate. He's camped on the Hudson near Saratoga with 6,500 men left. He's receiving no supplies from Canada. The route back is being cut off. And across the river, the American army is growing. Its commander is General Horatio Gates, a former British officer who defected to the American side. Gates isn't a tactical genius, but he's smart enough to listen to his subordinates. And his most valuable subordinate is a man who will become the hero of Saratoga, Benedict Arnold. Arnold is everything Burgoyne wishes he was. Brave, aggressive, a natural combat leader. He's already a legend among American soldiers for his march to Quebec and his naval actions on Lake Champlain. The men worship him. Gates doesn't trust him, sees him as a rival, but he can't deny Arnold's value. Arnold studies the ground around Saratoga and realizes something crucial. The British have to advance through a narrow corridor between the river and the forest. If the Americans can fortify the high ground above that corridor, they can turn it into a killing field. Arnold convinces Gates to let him position troops on Bemis Heights, a ridge overlooking the British line of advance. The Americans dig in. They build earthworks, cut fields of fire, position artillery. They're not running anymore. They're ready to fight. On September 19th, Burgoyne makes his move. He can't stay where he is. Supplies are almost gone. He can't go back. His pride won't allow it. So he marches forward, hoping to break through the American lines. He divides his army into 3 columns. General Simon Fraser takes 2,000 men on the right, through the forest. Burgoyne himself leads the center with over 1,000 men. General Friedrich von Riedesel commands the left, along the river road, with over 1,000 German troops. The plan is to advance together and hit the Americans from multiple directions. It's a classic European tactic, designed for open battlefields. But this isn't Europe. This is the American wilderness. Arnold sees the British columns advancing and realizes they're making a mistake. They're spreading out, separating themselves. If he can't hit them before they concentrate, he can defeat them in detail. He begs Gates for permission to attack. Gates refuses. He wants to wait behind the fortifications. Arnold is furious, but he's not the overall commander. He watches in agony as the British move into position. Then something happens that changes the battle. Gates, under pressure from his other officers, reluctantly agrees to send out a probing force. It's supposed to be a small reconnaissance. Arnold sees his chance. He takes command of the force and turns it into a full assault. The battle that erupts in the clearing called Freeman's Farm is chaos. It's not the neat linear warfare the British are used to. It's a swirling, savage brawl in the woods. The Americans are fighting from behind trees, firing and falling back, reloading and firing again. The British are trying to form lines, but their ranks keep breaking under the irregular fire. For 4 hours, the two sides tear each other apart. The British have the advantage in discipline and bayonets. The Americans have the advantage in numbers and knowledge of the terrain. Arnold is everywhere, rallying his men, leading charges, taking insane risks. His horse is shot out from under him. He grabs another and keeps fighting. By sunset, the British still hold Freeman's Farm, but just barely. They've lost over 600 men. The Americans have lost 300. On paper, it's a British victory. They held the field. In reality, it's a disaster for Burgoyne. He can't afford to lose 600 men in a single afternoon. He's running out of soldiers. He's running out of time. And the Americans are getting stronger every day. Militia are arriving by the hundreds. By the end of September, Gates has 11,000 men. Burgoyne has less than 6,000. The hunter has become the hunted. Burgoyne waits. He's hoping for a miracle. Maybe Howe will change his mind and march north. Maybe Clinton will send reinforcements from New York. Maybe the Americans will make a mistake. Days pass. Nothing happens. His supplies are almost gone. His men are on half rations. Horses are being slaughtered for meat. Desertion is becoming a problem. On October 3rd, he receives devastating news. A relief force sent from New York has turned back. No help is coming. He has 2 choices, retreat or attack. Retreating means admitting defeat, abandoning his artillery, and running a gauntlet of American militia. Attacking means throwing his exhausted, starving army against fortified positions, held by an enemy twice his size. Both options are terrible. He chooses to attack. On October 7th, Burgoyne launches what he calls a reconnaissance in force. It's really a desperate last gamble. He takes 1,500 of his best men and advances toward the American positions. He's hoping to find a weak spot, punch through, and create chaos. Arnold, who has been relieved of command by Gates after a bitter argument, is watching from the American camp. He's not supposed to be in this fight. Gates has sidelined him. But when Arnold sees the British advancing, something inside him snaps. He's spent his entire life preparing for this moment. He's not going to sit it out because of petty politics. He mounts his horse and rides toward the sound of gunfire. Gates sees him go and shouts for someone to stop him. No one does. The men love Arnold. They follow him into hell if he asks. The battle that follows is the most violent combat of the entire campaign. The British advance into a storm of American fire. Their lines waver. American troops, inspired by Arnold's presence, charge forward. The British fall back to a fortified position, called the Balcar Redoubt. Arnold leads a charge against it. It's suicide. The redoubt is too strong. The attack fails. Arnold doesn't care. He wheels his horse and gallops to another fortified position, the Bremont Redoubt, held by German troops. His men follow him, screaming like banshees. The attack on the Bremont Redoubt is pure fury. American soldiers swarm the walls. The Germans fight desperately, but they're overwhelmed. Arnold is in the thick of it, sword in hand, urging his men forward. Then a German soldier shoots him. The musket ball hits Arnold's left leg, the same leg that was wounded at Quebec. He goes down hard. His horse falls on top of him, crushing his leg further. American soldiers drag him to safety while the redoubt is overrun. The Germans break and run. The British right flank has collapsed. As darkness falls, Burgoyne realizes the battle is lost. He's lost another 600 men he can't replace. His line has been broken. His army is surrounded. That night, he orders a retreat to the heights of Saratoga. It's a nightmare march. Wounded men screaming, horses dying in the traces, artillery being abandoned because there are no horses left to pull it. By morning, Burgoyne's army is huddled on a hilltop, completely surrounded by over 13,000 Americans. There's no food. There's no escape. The rain is pouring down. The men are shivering in their soaked uniforms. And every hour more American troops arrive. Burgoyne holds a council of war. His officers tell him the truth. The army is finished. There's no hope of relief. If they try to fight, they'll be massacred. If they try to retreat, they'll be hunted down in the forest. There's only one option left. On October 13th, Burgoyne sends a message to Gates under a flag of truce. He wants to discuss terms. Gates, the cautious commander who has been content to let his subordinates do the fighting, suddenly becomes generous in victory. He offers Burgoyne a convention, not a surrender, but a convention. The British will march out with full honors. They'll keep their flags and their dignity. They'll be allowed to return to England on the condition that they never fight in America again. It's extraordinarily lenient. Burgoyne accepts immediately. On October 17th, 1777, the British Army marches out of its camp for the last time. The soldiers have polished their buttons and cleaned their muskets. They're trying to salvage some pride from this disaster. The American army is lined up on both sides of the road, watching silently. There's no jeering, no celebration, just quiet awe. These farmers and shopkeepers have just defeated one of the greatest military powers in history. Burgoyne rides up to Gates and offers his sword. Gates refuses it, treating Burgoyne as an equal. It's a moment of grace in the midst of catastrophe. 5,800 British and German soldiers lay down their arms. Their flags are furled. Their artillery is surrendered. Gentleman Johnny, the man who promised to crush the rebellion, has become the man who lost an army. The news of Saratoga spreads across the Atlantic like lightning. In London, the reaction is shock and disbelief. How could this happen? How could a professional army, led by a general handpicked by the king, be defeated by untrained rebels? Parliament erupts in recriminations. Heads will roll. Burgoyne will return to England in disgrace, spending the rest of his life trying to blame everyone but himself. But the real impact of Saratoga isn't in London. It's in Paris. The French have been watching the American Revolution with interest. They hate the British, their ancient enemy. They'd love to see Britain humiliated, but they're not going to back a losing cause. They need proof that the Americans can actually win. Saratoga is that proof. When Benjamin Franklin, the American ambassador to France, receives the news, he immediately requests an audience with the French foreign minister. the Comte de Vergennes. Franklin doesn't have to say much. The facts speak for themselves. An American army has captured an entire British army. The rebellion is real. The Americans can win. On February 6, 1778, France signs a treaty of alliance with the United States. It's a complete game changer. France brings money, weapons, ships, and soldiers. Spain and the Netherlands will follow. Britain is no longer fighting a colonial rebellion. It's fighting a world war. And it started because a pompous general underestimated his enemy. Saratoga proved something that the world had never seen before. A citizen army fighting for an idea could defeat professional soldiers fighting for a king. The men who won at Saratoga weren't career soldiers. They were farmers who grabbed their hunting rifles and walked to war. They were shopkeepers who left their stores. They were boys who lied about their age to enlist. They had no formal training. Their uniforms were whatever they owned. Some fought barefoot. But they had something the British didn't have. They were fighting for their homes, their families, their freedom. That made them unstoppable. The British establishment never understood this. They looked at the Americans and saw inferior copies of themselves. They thought loyalty to the crown was natural, and rebellion was a temporary madness that could be cured with violence. They couldn't comprehend that the Americans had created something new, a nation built on the idea that government derives its power from the consent of the governed. It was a revolutionary concept, literally, and it was worth dying for. The Battle of Saratoga wasn't the end of the war. The fighting would continue for 4 more years. There would be more battles, more suffering, more death. But after Saratoga, everyone knew how it would end. The British could win battles, but they couldn't win the war. The Americans had proven they could stand and fight. More importantly, they had proven they wouldn't quit. Burgoyne's surrender told the world that the American Revolution wasn't a rebellion anymore. It was a war of independence, and the Americans were going to win. If you visit Saratoga today, you'll find a quiet battlefield park in upstate New York. There are monuments and plaques marking where the fighting happened. You can walk the same ground where Arnold led his mad charges. You can stand on Bemis Heights and look down at the killing fields. But what you can't see is the weight of what happened there. You can't feel the desperation of Burgoyne's starving soldiers or the determination of the Americans who refused to be conquered. You can't hear the musket fire or smell the gunpowder. What happened at Saratoga was more than a military victory. It was a statement. It was a declaration that ordinary people, when pushed far enough, can change the world. The men who fought at Saratoga went home to their farms and their shops. Most of them never spoke about what they had done. They didn't think of themselves as heroes. They thought of themselves as citizens who'd done their duty. But history remembers them. They were the ones who stood in the rain and the mud and said no to an empire. They were the ones who proved that freedom isn't given, it's taken. And they were the ones who lit a fire that would spread across the globe, inspiring revolutions in France, in Latin America, in Europe. The American experiment, the idea that people could govern themselves, started in the forests of Saratoga. It started when 5,000 farmers destroyed the British plan to crush the rebellion. It started when ordinary men became legends. The tragedy of Saratoga, from the British perspective, is how utterly preventable it was. If Howe had marched north instead of sailing to Philadelphia, Burgoyne would have succeeded. If Burgoyne had retreated from Fort Edward instead of pushing forward, he would have saved his army. If the British had treated the American colonists as equals instead of rebellious children, there might never have been a war at all. But pride, arrogance, and a fundamental misunderstanding of what they were fighting led the British into disaster. They thought they were suppressing a tax revolt. They didn't realize they were trying to stop an idea whose time had come. Benedict Arnold, the hero of Saratoga, would later betray the American cause and become the most infamous traitor in American history. But on October 7, 1777, he was magnificent. He fought like a man possessed, leading from the front, risking everything. His leg, shattered by that German musket ball, never healed properly. He would walk with a limp for the rest of his life. Some historians argue that the pain and the lack of recognition he received after Saratoga, Gates took most of the credit, pushed him toward treason. But that's a story for another day. On that October afternoon, Arnold was exactly what the Americans needed, a warrior who refused to lose. Horatio Gates, who accepted Burgoyne's surrender and received the glory, wasn't a great general. He was a competent administrator who was in the right place at the right time. His real talent was taking credit for other people's work. After Saratoga, he was hailed as the hero of the North. Congress considered making him commander-in-chief instead of George Washington. But when Gates was given independent command later in the war, At the Battle of Camden in 1780, he was utterly routed. He fled the battlefield so fast that he set a record for the longest retreat by a general in American history. Saratoga was won by Arnold's aggression, by Daniel Morgan's riflemen, by the stubbornness of the American soldiers, and by Burgoyne's catastrophic mistakes. Gates just happened to be in charge when it happened. The German soldiers who surrendered at Saratoga, the so-called Hessians, were mercenaries rented to the British by various German princes. They had been told they were going to America to put down a minor uprising. Instead, they found themselves in a nightmare. They didn't understand the language. They didn't understand the politics. They were just trying to survive. After the surrender, many of them decided they liked America. They deserted, changed their names, and became farmers in Pennsylvania and New York. Their descendants are still there. They fought for King George, but they stayed for freedom. The Native American warriors who fought alongside Burgoyne were caught in an impossible situation. They had allied with the British because they saw the expanding American settlements as a threat to their lands. They were right. But their presence in Burgoyne's army gave the Americans a propaganda victory. Stories, some true, some exaggerated, of Native American atrocities against settlers spread across New England, driving more men to join the militia. After Saratoga, most of the tribes that had supported Burgoyne withdrew from the war. They realized the British were losing. The Americans would remember who had fought against them. The consequences for the Native American nations would be devastating. The Convention of Saratoga, the terms under which Burgoyne surrendered, was supposed to allow the British and German soldiers to return home. But Congress, encouraged by some in the Continental Army, decided to violate the terms. They held the prisoners in camps in Virginia and Pennsylvania for years. Some died of disease, some escaped, some were eventually exchanged. But the promise Gates made to Burgoyne was broken. It was a dark mark on the American victory, a reminder that even in a just war, honor can be sacrificed to expediency. The financial cost of Saratoga to the British was staggering. Every soldier, every musket, every cannon that was captured had to be replaced. Every ship that had transported supplies up the St. Lawrence and down Lake Champlain had been wasted. The British treasury, already strained by the costs of empire, was hemorrhaging money. And now, with France entering the war, those costs would multiply. Britain would have to defend India, the Caribbean, and the Mediterranean, all while trying to suppress the American rebellion. The empire's resources were finite. The Americans had just forced Britain to spread those resources across the globe. It was economic warfare, and it was devastating. The strategic lesson of Saratoga echoed through military history. Never extend your supply lines beyond your ability to defend them. Never underestimate your enemy. Never let pride dictate strategy. Burgoyne violated all three principles, and he paid the price. Military academies still teach Saratoga as a case study in how not to conduct a campaign. It's studied alongside other disasters like Napoleon's invasion of Russia and Hitler's advance on Stalingrad. The pattern is always the same. An overconfident commander pushes too far, too fast. The enemy refuses to cooperate with the plan. Supply lines collapse. Pride prevents retreat. And then, catastrophe. The political fallout in Britain was immediate and brutal. Lord George Germain, the Secretary of State for the American Department, who had approved Burgoyne's plan, was humiliated. He would cling to power for a few more years, but his credibility was destroyed. The War Party and Parliament, the ones who had insisted that the Americans could be crushed with a firm hand, were on the defensive. The Peace Party, led by men like Edmund Burke and Charles James Fox, gained strength. They argued that the war was unwinnable, that it was bankrupting the nation, that it was turning Britain's natural allies, the American colonists who shared language, law, and culture, into permanent enemies. They were right, but it would take 4 more years of bloodshed before the government finally admitted it. King George III took Saratoga personally. He'd been the driving force behind the policy of coercion. He'd believed that a show of force would bring the Americans to heel. Now his army had surrendered to a rabble of farmers. His generals were making excuses. His ministers were pointing fingers at each other, and his subjects were starting to question whether the war was worth fighting. George would never forgive the Americans for this humiliation. Even after the war ended, even after Britain recognized American independence, George harbored a bitter resentment. He'd been beaten by his own subjects, and it wounded his pride more than any military defeat could. The French decision to enter the war transformed everything. Before Saratoga, the American Revolution was a civil war within the British Empire. After Saratoga and the French alliance, it became a global conflict. French ships challenged British control of the seas. French troops landed in America, bringing professional soldiers and crucial artillery. French money kept the Continental Army supplied. Without France, the Americans might have won eventually, but it would have taken much longer and cost many more lives. Saratoga made the French alliance possible, and the French alliance made American independence inevitable. The Spanish and Dutch followed France's lead, seeing an opportunity to weaken their British rival. Spain wanted to reclaim Gibraltar and Florida. The Dutch wanted to protect their lucrative trade. Neither cared much about American independence, but they both hated Britain, so they joined the war, forcing Britain to defend interests around the world. British garrisons in India faced French and Mysorean troops. British islands in the Caribbean were attacked by French and Spanish fleets. British convoys in the North Sea were harassed by Dutch raiders. The Empire was fighting on a dozen fronts simultaneously, and it was losing, all because Gentleman Johnny Burgoyne had marched too far into the American wilderness. The soldiers who fought at Saratoga, on both sides, shared a strange bond. Years later, when peace had come and the wounds had healed, British veterans and American veterans would sometimes meet. They'd share a drink and talk about that October, when they'd tried to kill each other in the forests of New York. They'd remember the men who hadn't come home. They'd argue about who had fought better, but underneath the arguments there was respect. They'd both been tested in the crucible of combat, and they'd both survived. The war that had made them enemies had also made them brothers in a way that civilians could never understand. The weapons used at Saratoga were primitive by modern standards, smoothbore muskets that were accurate to maybe 50 yards on a good day. Soldiers had to stand in lines, shoulder to shoulder, and fire volleys, because individual marksmanship was nearly impossible. The Brown Bess musket used by the British weighed 10 pounds. It took 30 seconds for a trained soldier to load and fire. The ball it fired was soft lead, 3/4 of an inch in diameter. If it hit bone, it shattered it. If it hit flesh, it tumbled and tore a massive wound. There were no antibiotics, no anesthesia beyond rum or whiskey. If you were wounded in the stomach or chest, you died slowly in agony. If you were wounded in a limb, the surgeon would probably amputate, and even then, infection would likely kill you. The men who fought at Saratoga knew all of this, and they fought anyway. The American advantage at Saratoga wasn't in equipment or training, it was in numbers and terrain. The British had better muskets, better artillery, better discipline. But the Americans had more men, and they knew the ground. They'd grown up hunting in these forests. They knew how to move quietly, how to find cover, how to disappear and reappear where the enemy least expected. The British soldiers, trained to fight on the open battlefields of Europe, were lost in the American woods. They couldn't see their enemy, they couldn't form proper lines. Their tactics, designed for European warfare, were useless in the wilderness. And so they died, shot by men they never saw, trapped in a war they didn't understand. The artillery at Saratoga played a crucial role, but not the way Burgoyne intended. He'd brought 138 cannons from Canada, thinking they would blast through American fortifications. But dragging those heavy guns through the wilderness had exhausted his army. Many were abandoned on the march. The ones that made it to Saratoga were used by both sides in the final battle. When the British surrendered, the Americans captured 42 cannons, a massive boost to their firepower. Those guns would be used in later battles, turned against their former owners. Burgoyne's artillery, which was supposed to be his advantage, became the means of his destruction. The role of scouts and intelligence at Saratoga cannot be overstated. The Americans had a massive advantage here. Local farmers and hunters brought them constant updates on British movements. They knew where Burgoyne's troops were camped, how many men he had, what condition they were in. The British, by contrast, were operating blind. Burgoyne's Native American scouts had largely abandoned him after Bennington. His cavalry was useless in the thick forests. He had no idea how many Americans he was facing, or where they were positioned. He was leading his army through enemy territory with a blindfold on. It's a miracle he lasted as long as he did. The weather played its part in Burgoyne's defeat. The autumn rains turned roads into rivers of mud. The morning fogs made navigation nearly impossible. The early cold sapped the strength of men, who were already underfed and exhausted. Soldiers who had grown up in England and Germany weren't prepared for the brutal extremes of an American climate. They'd been told America was a temperate paradise. Instead, they found a land that was trying to kill them as surely as the enemy was. Nature itself had joined the American side. The psychological impact of Saratoga on the British Army was devastating. Before Saratoga, British soldiers believed they were invincible. They'd beaten the French in the 7 Years' War. They'd crushed rebellions across the empire. They were the finest infantry in the world. After Saratoga, that myth was shattered. If one British army could be defeated and captured, so could others. The aura of invincibility was gone. British soldiers in other parts of America began to doubt. They began to question whether the war could be won. That doubt, that uncertainty, was as damaging as any battlefield loss. The American army that emerged from Saratoga was transformed. They'd started the campaign as a collection of militia units, barely organized, barely trained. They ended it as a real army. They'd faced British regulars and won. They'd captured an entire enemy army. They'd proven to themselves that they could fight and win. The confidence that victory gave them sustained the Continental Army through the dark years ahead. When they were starving at Valley Forge, when they were losing battles in the South, they could look back at Saratoga and remember, we beat them once, we can beat them again. The medical reality of Saratoga was horrific. There were no antibiotics, no proper anesthesia, no understanding of germ theory. Surgeons worked in barns and tents, operating on men lying on blood-stained tables. They had a few basic instruments, saws for amputation, knives for cutting, probes for extracting bullets. They worked by candlelight, cutting off shattered limbs while the patient bit down on a leather strap and screamed. The mortality rate for abdominal wounds was nearly 100%. Chest wounds weren't much better. Even a minor wound could become infected and kill you within days. The men who survived the battles often died in the weeks after from their wounds. The casualty lists kept growing long after the fighting stopped. The logistics of feeding and supplying the armies at Saratoga tells its own story. The Americans, operating in their own territory, could draw on local farms and mills. They had supply lines back to New England. When they ran low on something, they could send wagons to fetch more. Burgoyne, by contrast, was dependent on a single supply line stretching back to Canada. Every biscuit, every musket ball, every horseshoe nail had to be transported hundreds of miles through hostile territory. When that supply line was cut, his army started to die. Wars aren't won just by brave soldiers and clever tactics. They're won by the unglamorous work of logistics, of making sure your army has food and ammunition when it needs them. Burgoyne failed at logistics, and it killed his campaign. The impact of Saratoga on Native American tribes was profound and tragic. The Iroquois Confederacy, which had managed to remain relatively neutral, was torn apart by the conflict. Some tribes supported the British, seeing them as the lesser threat to their lands. Others supported the Americans, hoping for better treatment. In the end, both sides used the tribes and discarded them. After the war, American settlers flooded onto native lands with the full support of the new government. The tribes that had fought for the British were punished, but so were the tribes that had fought for the Americans. The Revolution for Native Americans was a catastrophe that destroyed their traditional lands and ways of life. Saratoga accelerated that catastrophe by ensuring American victory. The fate of the Loyalists, Americans who remained loyal to the British Crown, was another tragedy of Saratoga. Before the battle, Loyalists in New York and elsewhere hoped that the British would crush the rebellion and restore order. After Saratoga, they realized the British might lose. Many fled to Canada or back to Britain, abandoning their homes and property. Those who stayed faced persecution, mob violence, and legal retribution. Their lands were confiscated. Their businesses were destroyed. Some were tarred and feathered or worse. The American Revolution, like all civil wars, destroyed families and communities. Saratoga didn't just defeat the British Army. It doomed the Loyalist cause. The role of African Americans at Saratoga is often overlooked. Both armies included black soldiers, though in different roles. The British promised freedom to enslaved people who joined their side, and thousands took the offer. The Americans were more reluctant to arm black soldiers, but necessity forced them to. Several black soldiers fought at Saratoga, some as freemen, some as enslaved men sent by their masters. Their contributions were rarely acknowledged. After the war, many black loyalists who had fought for the British were evacuated to Nova Scotia or Sierra Leone. Black patriots who fought for the Americans often found their freedom promises broken. The Revolution's promise of liberty didn't extend equally to all. The diplomatic maneuvering around Saratoga was as important as the battle itself. Benjamin Franklin in Paris was playing a dangerous game. He had to convince the French that the Americans could win without revealing how desperate the situation actually was. Saratoga gave him the perfect card to play. He presented it not as a close-run battle that could have gone either way, but as proof of American military superiority. The French bought it. They saw Saratoga as evidence that investing in the American cause was a good bet. Franklin, the scientist and printer turned diplomat, spun Saratoga into a French alliance. It was one of the greatest diplomatic achievements in American history. The class dynamics at Saratoga were fascinating. In the British Army, all the officers were aristocrats or gentlemen. They'd bought their commissions. They saw military service as a duty of their class. The enlisted men were the dregs of society, recruited from prisons and poorhouses. The officers didn't respect them, and the men didn't trust their officers. In the American Army, the dynamic was different. Many American officers had risen through the ranks based on merit. They had been elected by their men. The soldiers followed them because they had earned respect, not because of their birth. This difference in leadership showed in battle. British officers led from behind. American officers, like Arnold, led from the front. The environmental impact of the Saratoga campaign was significant. Thousands of men and horses tramped through the wilderness, cutting trees, burning fields, fouling water sources. The forests around the battlefield were stripped for firewood and fortifications. It would take decades for the land to recover, but the Americans didn't care about environmental impact. They cared about survival. They'd burn every tree in New York if it meant winning the war. The British, invading someone else's country, were less willing to destroy everything. It was another small advantage for the Americans. The propaganda value of Saratoga was immense. The Americans printed pamphlets celebrating the victory. They exaggerated the size of Burgoyne's army and downplayed the closeness of the fighting. They portrayed it as a one-sided triumph, proof that Americans were superior soldiers to the British. It was nonsense, of course. The battle had been desperate and could have gone either way. But the propaganda worked. It boosted American morale and convinced wavering neutrals to support the cause. In war, perception often matters more than reality. The Americans understood this. The British, with their rigid insistence on factual accuracy in official reports, did not. The technological lessons of Saratoga were minimal. This wasn't a battle won by superior weapons or innovative tactics. It was won by numbers, terrain, and determination. The muskets, cannons, and swords used at Saratoga were the same ones that had been used for decades. There were no technological breakthroughs, no secret weapons. It was just men shooting and stabbing each other in the old-fashioned way. The real innovation was political and social. The idea that a citizen army could defeat professional soldiers. That idea, proven at Saratoga, would inspire revolutionary movements for the next 2 centuries. The religious dimension of Saratoga shouldn't be ignored. Many American soldiers saw the war as a holy crusade. They believed God was on their side, that they were fighting for religious liberty against British tyranny. Preachers told them that victory was ordained by Providence. After Saratoga, this belief intensified. How else could a small army of farmers defeat the British Empire except through divine intervention? The British, for their part, assumed God favored the established order. Burgoyne's defeat shook that assumption. If God had abandoned the British, what did that say about the righteousness of their cause? These weren't questions that generals asked, but soldiers thought about them in the dark, desperate hours. The economic impact of Saratoga on the American colonies was complex. The victory boosted morale and encouraged investment in the war effort, but it also prolonged the conflict, which meant more disruption to trade, more destruction of property, more inflation of the continental currency. In the short term, Saratoga was economically devastating. Farms were destroyed. Businesses collapsed. The Continental Congress issued more and more paper money that became increasingly worthless. But in the long term, by securing French support, Saratoga made ultimate victory possible. And victory meant independence, which opened up new markets and opportunities. It was a calculated risk that paid off. The legacy of Saratoga in American memory is powerful but complicated. It's celebrated as a great victory, and it was. But the heroes of the battle are often misidentified. History books credit Gates, who contributed little. They ignore Arnold, who won the battle but later betrayed his country. They overlook the thousands of ordinary soldiers whose names we don't know. The real story of Saratoga is a story of collective effort, of an army that held together despite every reason to fall apart. It's not the story of one great man. It's the story of thousands of ordinary men who did extraordinary things. The British army that surrendered at Saratoga was never seen again as a cohesive unit. The soldiers were supposed to be repatriated, but as mentioned, Congress violated the convention and held them prisoner. Some eventually went home, some died in captivity, some deserted and melted into the American population. The regiments that had marched so proudly down Lake Champlain were disbanded and scattered. For the British military, it was a humiliation that stung for generations. The loss of an entire army was unprecedented in British history. It would be studied and analyzed and picked apart by military theorists trying to understand what went wrong. The myth-making around Saratoga began immediately after the battle and has never stopped. Every generation of Americans has retold the story to fit their own needs. In the 19th century, it was a story of Anglo-Saxon racial superiority, Americans proving they were better than other Europeans. In the 20th century, it became a story of democratic values defeating tyranny, a precursor to World War II. Today, it's often told as a story of resistance against overwhelming odds, of ordinary people standing up to power. All these interpretations have some truth, but they all miss something important. Saratoga was messy, brutal, and uncertain. It wasn't inevitable. It could have gone the other way. The men who fought there didn't feel like heroes. They felt scared and tired and desperate. They won because they refused to quit, not because they were destined to. If you visit Saratoga National Historical Park today, you can walk the battlefield. You can see the earthworks that American soldiers dug. You can stand where Arnold was wounded. You can look out from the heights where the British made their last stand. It's beautiful country, rolling hills and forests. It's hard to imagine it soaked in blood, echoing with screams and gunfire. But that's what happened there. Men died in those fields for an idea, the idea that people could govern themselves. That idea, purchased with blood at Saratoga, has shaped the world we live in. It's worth remembering what it cost. It's worth honoring the men on both sides who paid that price. The final word on Saratoga belongs to the soldiers who fought there. In their letters and diaries, they didn't write about strategy or geopolitics. They wrote about cold nights and empty bellies. They wrote about friends who died and wounds that wouldn't heal. They wrote about wanting to go home. But they also wrote about why they stayed. They stayed because their comrades needed them. They stayed because they'd started something they needed to finish. They stayed because, despite everything, they believed in what they were fighting for. That belief, that stubborn refusal to give up, won the Battle of Saratoga. It won the American Revolution, and it created a nation.